The day Bessie Wallace buried her husband, the sky over the Texas panhandle turned the color of a bruise, and every man in Haskell County figured she would be gone before the first frost. They were wrong. Thomas Wallace had died in the summer of 1882, thrown from a horse that spooked at a rattlesnake in the tall grass behind the south pasture. He was 31 years old, and he left behind a wife of 28, 240 acres of semi-arid land that pressed up against the Canadian River, a herd of 43 longhorn cattle, a barn that needed a new roof, and a 7-year-old boy named Henry who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. Bessie stood at Thomas's grave on that bruise-colored afternoon, her hands clasped at her waist, her black dress already stiff with dust from the long walk to the cemetery, and she made herself a private promise. She would not sell. She would not move to her sister's place in Amarillo. She would not ask for help. That third vow was the one that would cost her everything, and it was the one she would keep the longest. The land that touched the eastern edge of the Wallace property belonged to a man named Clyde Bailey, and had belonged to his family before him. Clyde was 33 years old that summer Thomas died, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with hands so calloused they looked like they were made from the land itself. He ran about 400 acres of cattle, kept a small vegetable patch that embarrassed him whenever anyone noticed it, and lived alone in a 2-room house he had built with his father 8 years before his father's heart gave out. He had known Thomas Wallace the way all neighboring ranchers knew each other in the Texas Panhandle in 1882, through fence disputes that were settled over coffee, through cattle drives where you helped each other and kept careful count, through the kind of easy, uncomplicated friendship that grows between men who share a boundary line and mutual respect. He had liked Thomas. When Thomas died, Clyde felt the loss in a quiet, solid way that had no name. He also felt something else, something he could not quite examine in those early days. He had met Bessie Wallace a handful of times at the general store in Tascosa, at the church social the previous Easter, at the county gathering where Thomas had introduced her with a pride so obvious it was nearly embarrassing. She had shaken Clyde's hand with a firm grip and looked at him with brown eyes that were so direct and clear they made him feel, for a moment, that she could see clean through his ribcage. After Thomas died, Clyde rode over to the Wallace place on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, and offered his condolences and his labor. He told Bessie he could have 2 of his ranch hands, Emilio and George, come over and patch the barn roof before the autumn rains came. He told her it would not cost her anything except a meal, and that the offer was genuine. Bessie stood on the porch of her farmhouse in the same black dress, her son Henry standing just behind her with one hand gripping her skirt, and she looked at Clyde for a long moment with those direct brown eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," she said, "but we will manage." Clyde nodded, put his hat back on, and rode home. He told himself she needed time. He was right. What he did not know was that she also needed to prove something to herself, something that went so deep it was almost structural, like a post driven into the earth. The autumn rains came, and 2 sections of the barn roof gave way. Bessie patched them herself with lumber she could barely afford, working in the rain with Henry holding a lantern, and trying not to cry. The cattle survived the winter because she worked them with a ferocity that impressed even the grizzled older ranchers who rode past and did not offer to stop. By spring of 1883, she had sold 12 head at a fair price and paid her note at the bank in Tascosa with exactly $2 left over. Word got around, the way word always gets around in small Texas communities. People spoke of Bessie Wallace with a mixture of admiration and something that was almost pity, though it would have enraged her to know they felt that way. Some people said Thomas must not have left her much. Some people said she was too proud for her own good. Some people said she was the bravest woman in Haskell County. The women at the church social sent over a pie in October, a ham at Christmas, and Bessie accepted these with genuine gratitude and careful dignity, because food was not the same as charity, and she knew the difference. Clyde Bailey watched all of this from the eastern side of his fence line, with the particular kind of patient attention that men who spend long years alone on open land develop as naturally as they develop a tolerance for wind. He was not watching in any intrusive way. He simply noticed. He noticed the way her smoke came up thin and early in the mornings, the way she drove her wagon into Tascosa alone, the way her cattle sometimes drifted toward his fence line in the dry weeks, and she always came herself to drive them back, never asking him to hold them. In the spring of 1883, after the winter had stripped everything down to its bones, he rode over again. He told her his fence on the north line needed reinforcing and that it would serve both their herds if they worked it together. He was not quite lying. The fence did need reinforcing, but it did not need both of them, and she probably knew it. "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," she said, in exactly the same measured tone, from almost exactly the same spot on the porch. "But Henry and I will ride the fence ourselves next week." Henry was 8 years old and barely tall enough to reach the fence posts. Clyde tipped his hat and rode home again. He had a conversation with Emilio, his best ranch hand, a lean and steady Mexican man of about 40 who had worked the panhandle cattle route since he was a teenager and who had the gift of saying complicated things simply. "She does not want to owe anyone," Emilio said, not looking up from the saddle he was mending. "I know that," Clyde said. "Then you know why she will not let you help." "I do not understand it," Clyde said. "Accepting help is not the same as being weak." Emilio looked up then, with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of human nature and finds most of it predictable. "It is when you are trying to convince yourself you are not." Clyde chewed on that for a long time. The summer of 1883 was brutally dry. The Canadian River ran low, and the grass on the open range turned brittle and pale by July. Several ranchers in the county sold off more cattle than they wanted to because the water situation was desperate. Bessie Wallace did not sell. She dug out the old stone water tank on the southwest corner of her property with help from only Henry, who was by now old enough to use a shovel without falling over, and she rooted the runoff from the creek bed that crossed her land into it during the brief summer rains with a system of shallow trenches that was genuinely ingenious for someone who had never studied hydraulics. Clyde found out about the trenches when the same runoff that used to drift across his eastern boundary line stopped coming. He rode over, not with irritation but with curiosity, and found the trench system snaking through the dry grass along Bessie's fence line. He stood over it for a long time, hat in his hands, and felt something he had not felt in years, which was a kind of astonishment at another person. He did not ask about it. He rerouted his own water accordingly and filed the image of those hand-dug trenches somewhere in the back of his mind where he kept things that mattered. Henry Wallace turned 9 that autumn, and he had developed a habit of slipping under the fence between the two properties to talk to Emilio, who was teaching him, without anyone's formal permission, how to read brands and read the sky. Bessie knew about this and said nothing, which Clyde took as a kind of accidental truce. He never directly approached Henry, because that felt like using the boy to get around his mother, and whatever Clyde's feelings were becoming, they would not permit that. But sometimes Henry would relay information unintentionally, the way children do. Henry once told his mother over supper that Emilio said Mr. Bailey's north well had gone alkaline, and the cattle were having trouble with it. Bessie made sure her cattle stayed away from the shared fence on the north line for the next 3 weeks, without explaining why to Henry. Clyde found out later from Emilio, who found out from Henry, who apparently found out nothing because he had simply observed his mother adjusting the cattle patterns, and told Emilio in the offhand way children tell everything. Clyde sat with this information for an evening and felt something warm move through his chest that he could not entirely account for. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard. There was an ice storm in January that killed 8 of Bessie's cattle and crippled 2 more. Clyde lost 4 head himself, which was manageable for his operation, but would have been serious for anyone running her numbers. He knew she was hurting. He also knew she would not come to him. He sent Emilio with a written note. The note said he had more hay than he needed, that he was sending 2 wagon loads over as payment for the water routing she had done the previous summer, which had saved him the trouble of rerouting his own supply. This was a technical lie dressed as a technical truth, and he hoped she would accept the terms because they gave her something to point to that was not charity. Bessie read the note twice. She sent Emilio back with the note, and a written reply that said she appreciated the gesture, but that the water trench had been done for her own benefit, and she did not consider it a service rendered to Mr. Bailey, and that she would buy the hay if she could afford it, and that at this time she could not. Emilio delivered this reply with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned to carry difficult messages without adding to their weight. Clyde read it and pressed his mouth together and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "She is the most stubborn woman I have ever encountered." Emilio said, "Yes." "Does she know," Clyde said carefully, "that the cattle she lost, does she know she is going to be short on her spring numbers?" "She knows," Emilio said. "Henry told me she was up until midnight doing her tallies." Clyde was quiet again for a moment. Then he asked, "How is Henry?" "He is fine," Emilio said. "He asked me to show him how to pull a breech calf. I told him he needed to grow about 4 more inches first." Clyde almost smiled. Almost. Spring of 1884 came in dry and mean, and Bessie made her spring cattle drive to Tascosa with 31 head instead of the 38 she had planned on. The price was decent that year, which saved her, though just barely. She came back from Tascosa with cash in her coat pocket, and a new length of rope, and a bag of cornmeal, and the expression of a woman who has survived something, and does not wish to make a ceremony of it. That summer, Clyde made a decision that felt, even as he was making it, like crossing a line of some kind. Not a fence line, but something less visible and more consequential. He was 35 years old. He had been living alone in his 2-room house for long enough that he had forgotten what it was like to have another voice in it in the evenings. He had not thought much about this until the last 2 years, which told him something. He had not courted anyone since a brief and unsuccessful attempt with a woman in Tascosa who had eventually married the dry goods merchant, and he had not missed her particularly, which also told him something. What he had come to feel for Bessie Wallace was not something he had chosen. It had grown in the way things grow in the panhandle, slowly and under difficult conditions, until one day you look and something is there that was not there before. He admired her with a kind of fierceness that surprised him. He worried about her with the steady, habitual concern of a man who watches weather. He thought about her brown eyes at inconvenient moments and told himself this was foolishness. He knew she was not ready. He was not even sure she would ever be ready. What he did know was that whatever he felt, he would not let it become an instrument of pressure on her. If she needed help, he would try to provide it. If she refused it, he would find another way or accept her refusal. He would not use his feelings to make demands on a woman who had spent 2 years building something entirely alone. This was the code he set for himself, in the private accounting of his own character, and he held to it. In the fall of 1884, something happened that changed the texture of the silence between them. Bessie's horse, a gray mare named Agnes that had been her husband's horse before it was hers, went lame with a bad split hoof on a Sunday morning when Henry was out cutting wood, and Bessie was alone on the North Range trying to move a group of cattle that had gotten themselves confused by the dry creek bed. She was 3 miles from the house when the mare went down. Not fell. Just stopped and refused to go further in the way a horse does when it is in real pain and knows it. Bessie checked the hoof, found the split, pressed her lips together, and stood in the middle of the flat Texas land under a sky that was enormous and indifferent, and she calculated her options. She could walk back to the house. She could leave Agnes and walk to the nearest fence line and hope someone passed. The cattle she had been moving were already drifting back toward the dry creek bed, and she could see two of them investigating a section of Clyde Bailey's fence with the particular slow stupidity of cattle who have already decided they are going to go through it if no one intervenes. She was standing there, weighing all of this, when she heard hooves. Clyde Bailey came around the rise on his big bay, gelding at a steady lope, not hurrying, in the way a man hurries when he has seen something from a distance and does not want to alarm anyone. He pulled up 20 feet away and tipped his hat, taking in the lame mare, the scattered cattle, and Bessie standing in the middle of it all with her arms crossed and her expression already preparing a refusal. "Agnes go lame," he said. "Split hoof," she said. "I can manage." "I can see that," he said in a tone that was entirely without irony. "I was heading toward my north fence anyway. Those two are going to go through it if someone does not head them off." He looked at the cattle, not at her. He said it as though it were the simple truth and not an excuse, and it was close enough to the simple truth that she could not argue with it. "I would appreciate it," she said carefully, "if you could hold them while I walk back for my other horse." "I can do that," he said. He did not offer her his horse or suggest she ride back with him. He simply turned the bay and headed toward the cattle at an easy trot. She watched him go for a moment. Then she started the 3-mile walk back to the house. When she returned on her second horse, a small brown quarter horse named Cooper, the cattle were in a neat group near the tree line, and Clyde Bailey was sitting on his horse a comfortable distance away, watching them with the unhurried patience of a man who has nothing but time. He had also, she noticed, hobbled Agnes and tied her loosely to the fence post in a way that kept her calm and off the bad hoof. "Thank you," Bessie said, and meant it without qualification. "Hoof will need wrapping and rest for 2 weeks," he said. "She will be fine." "I know," Bessie said. There was a pause. The wind moved through the dry grass with that constant low sound that is the particular music of the Texas panhandle. "Your water trench saved me 3 days of work last summer," Clyde said, not looking at her. "I recalculated my north line drainage because of it, worked better than what I had before." Bessie looked at him. He was still looking at the cattle. "I did not do it for your benefit," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it helped anyway." Another pause. "Henry tells me you have been teaching him to read weather signs," she said. "Emilio has," Clyde said. "I just let him watch the sky. He comes home and tells me what cloud formations mean," Bessie said. "He is very serious about it." Something moved in Clyde's expression, a softening so brief she might have imagined it. "He is a good boy," he said. "He has his mother's eyes." Bessie blinked. It was an unusual thing to say, and he said it simply, without apparent awareness of what it revealed, and then he turned his horse back toward the eastern fence line and said, "I will let you drive them in." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wallace," and rode away before she could respond. She drove the cattle in alone, the way she always did, but something had shifted in the air behind her. She did not examine it closely. She was not ready to examine it. The winter of 1884 was manageable. Spring of 1885 brought good rain and good prices, and Bessie made her first real profit since Thomas died, enough to hire a temporary hand through the summer. A young man from Oklahoma named Jim Rook, who was only 20, and did not know much but was willing to learn, and did not talk too much, which were the qualifications Bessie found most essential. With Jim's help, she repaired the barn properly for the first time, replaced 3 sections of fence on the south line, and expanded her vegetable garden enough to preserve through the winter. Henry, who was now 10 and beginning to show the quick, lean competence of a boy being raised on hard work, helped with all of it with the seriousness of someone who understands that what he is doing matters. Clyde watched the summer progress from his side of the fence line with the distinct sensation of something that might, if he were not careful, become longing. He watched the smoke from her stovepipe in the evenings. He watched Jim Rook ride the perimeter in the mornings, and felt a brief, unworthy flicker of something that was not quite jealousy, but was adjacent to it, which he dealt with by going and doing an extra hour of fence work until it passed. He was 36 years old and living alone, and the evenings were very long. In the summer of 1885, Tascosa was in a period of growth and turbulence, as all panhandle towns were in those years. The cattle trails were busy, the saloons were full, and there were enough men passing through with enough energy and unpredictability to make the town occasionally dangerous in the easy way that frontier towns become dangerous, in short flares, quickly resolved. Bessie drove into town twice a month for supplies, and ignored most of it with the practice of a woman who had learned to move through the world as though she owned every inch of the ground under her feet. One afternoon in August, she was loading flour sacks into her wagon outside Callahan's dry goods store when two men she did not know, trail hands from a drive that had stopped outside town, decided to be obtuse about whether her wagon was blocking their horses. It was not meaningfully, but they had been drinking since noon and found the exercise amusing. Bessie told them in a flat, measured voice to step back and let her finish loading, which she would complete in 3 minutes, and then they could have all the space they needed. One of them reached out and grabbed her wrist. What happened next happened in a particular order. Bessie's free hand caught the man across the ear with an open palm, hard enough that he stumbled back. The man's companion started forward, and then Clyde Bailey, who had been coming out of the feed store across the street with a 50-pound sack on his shoulder, set the sack down in the street and crossed it in about 6 strides and put himself between Bessie and the second man without making a particular production of it. He did not draw the revolver at his hip. He just stood there, all 6 feet and 200 pounds of quiet, undemonstrative Texas ranch man, and looked at the second trail hand with the particular expression of a person who is not angry, just decided. The two trail hands looked at each other and decided that Tascosa had other places to be and that flour wagon disputes were perhaps not worth the investment of their afternoon. They left. Clyde turned back to find Bessie finishing loading the flour sack herself, her spine very straight and her chin at that particular angle that he had come to understand meant she was managing some feeling she would not display. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. "Though I had it managed." "You had it managed," he agreed. "I just sped things up." She looked at him directly then, those clear brown eyes with the composure behind them, and something passed across her face that he could not quite name. It was not softness exactly, but it was something adjacent to it. "Mr. Bailey," she said, "I have been managing this ranch on my own for 3 years." "I know you have," he said. "I have been watching." The words came out more honestly than he had intended, and he watched her register them. The color that came up under her brown skin told him she had heard the full weight of what he had not meant to say. He picked up his feed sack and said, "Safe ride home, Mrs. Wallace," and walked back to his wagon without looking at her again. He drove home faster than necessary and spent the evening being irritable at Emilio, who accepted this with the serenity of a man who has seen all of this coming for approximately 2 years and finds the progress simultaneously amusing and moving. Bessie drove home and sat on the porch after Henry was in bed and thought about the words "I have been watching" for longer than she intended to. She thought about the way Clyde Bailey had put himself between her and trouble without asking her permission or making her feel like it was a rescue, without grandstanding, without expecting gratitude. She thought about his face, which was a good face, weathered and honest, with a steadiness behind it that was nothing like Thomas's warm, easy energy, but that had its own particular kind of gravity. Thomas had been her great love. She had known that from the first week. She had loved him with an uncomplicated wholeness that she had assumed was simply what love was, and then he had died and taken that assumption with him, and she had spent 3 years learning that she was more than the woman who had loved Thomas Wallace. She was Bessie Wallace. She was 240 acres and 40 cattle and hand-dug water trenches, and a son with dark eyes, and this land under a sky so big it could break you open if you let it. She was not sure she was ready to be anything else yet. She was almost sure. The fall of 1885 brought the kind of cool, golden weather that the Texas Panhandle occasionally grants as compensation for everything else it dishes out. And in that weather things began, carefully and almost accidentally, to change. Henry had progressed beyond brand reading and skywatching with Emilio, and had taken to hanging around Clyde's barn on Saturday afternoons, not in a sneaky way but in the forthright way of a 10-year-old who had decided this was a worthwhile thing to do and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Clyde had started, also in a forthright way, teaching the boy to train a young horse named Pepper, a spotted pony that was too small for ranch work but too spirited to leave unschooled. Bessie knew about this. She had watched Henry ride home on Cooper one Saturday afternoon, talking about nothing but Pepper and Mr. Bailey's patience, and the way the horse was already learning to come to a whistle. She had let it continue because it made Henry's face light up in a way that reached something behind her sternum and squeezed it gently, and because she had no real reason to object except the principle of keeping a careful distance from Clyde Bailey, and principle without reason is just stubbornness. On a Saturday in late October, she rode over herself to collect Henry, who had lost track of time. She tied Cooper at the post and walked through the gate and found Henry and Clyde in the small paddock, the boy standing at the center with his arm extended, and the spotted pony walking toward him with careful, deliberate steps, its eyes on Henry's face. Clyde was standing at the fence rail with his arms crossed, watching, and he did not hear her come up behind him. She stood there for a moment watching the boy and the horse in the golden afternoon light, and something in her chest did a thing it had not done in a long time. Not grief, the opposite of grief. "He has a real gift with horses," Clyde said without turning around. He must have heard her step. "Thomas was the same way," she said. A pause. Neither of them moved. "I know," Clyde said. "Thomas used to work the horses on the North Drive. I watched him once. He had that same way of being still." She had not expected him to say something about Thomas with that particular ease and directness. Not awkward, not performative, just simple acknowledgement, and it undid something in her that she had not known was knotted. "He died 3 years ago this past July," she said. "Yes," Clyde said. "I have been angry about it," she said, "for most of those 3 years, not at anything, just angry." He turned then very slowly and looked at her. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it. No performance of casualness, no deflection. Just a man looking at a woman and letting what he felt be visible for the length of time it took to say what needed saying. "That makes sense," he said. "He left you alone in a hard place." "He did not mean to," she said quickly. "No," Clyde said, "but it was hard anyway." Henry had reached the pony now and was rubbing its nose with the focused tenderness of a child who takes loving things seriously. Neither of the adults said anything for a moment. "You have done something extraordinary, Bessie," Clyde said, and her given name in his voice was so unexpected and so careful that she felt it like a match struck in a dark room. He seemed to realize what he had said and added, "Mrs. Wallace, I beg your pardon." "No," she said. She did not say anything else, just no. He looked at her. "No," she said again, softer. "You can call me Bessie." Something moved across Clyde Bailey's face that she would remember for the rest of her life, a kind of quiet, carefully contained joy that was all the more powerful for how contained it was. "Bessie," he said simply, as though trying the weight of it. Henry chose that moment to look up and say, "Mama, come look at Pepper, he is doing the whistle thing." And the moment broke cleanly in two, and Bessie walked into the paddock to see the spotted pony, and things were different after that. Not dramatically different. Not all at once. This was the Texas Panhandle in 1885, and these were careful, private people, and nothing moved fast except the weather. But things were different. Clyde began to ride over on Sundays, not to offer help, just to check the shared fence line, which was a reasonable excuse for about 2 Sundays before neither of them bothered with the excuse anymore. He would come in the early afternoon, and Bessie would pour coffee from the heavy pot on the stove, and they would sit on the porch or at the kitchen table and talk. They talked about cattle prices and drought patterns, and whether the XIT ranch's expansion was going to push out the smaller operations around it, and about Henry's progress with the pony, and about the winter they were both preparing for, and about Emilio's family back in New Mexico that he had left at 16 and sometimes talked about in the evenings. They talked around the things they did not yet talk about with the practiced care of two people who have been alone long enough to know the value of what they might be building and do not wish to handle it carelessly. Henry noticed. Henry was 10 years old and direct about most things. One evening in November he looked up from his supper and said, "Mama, do you like Mr. Bailey?" Bessie put down her fork. "He is a good neighbor," she said. Henry considered this. "He looks at you different than other people look at you," Henry said. "Emilio looks at the cattle like that, like he is keeping track." Bessie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eat your supper, Henry." Henry ate his supper, but he looked satisfied in the way of someone who has made a point. That night, Bessie sat at the small writing desk Thomas had built in the corner of the bedroom, and she wrote in the journal she had kept since Thomas died. She had used it mostly to record practical matters: cattle numbers, rainfall, expenses, the occasional note about Henry's milestones. She turned to a blank page and she wrote, "I am afraid. I do not know exactly what of. I do not know if I am afraid that it will come to nothing or afraid that it will come to something." She read it back and then she added, "He is a good man." Thomas would have said the same. She closed the journal and sat for a long time with her hands folded on the cover. Clyde Bailey spent that same November evening doing what he often did, which was sitting on his porch after supper looking at the land in the dark, which in the panhandle was a particular kind of dark, enormous and full of stars, the sky so clear and wide it was almost loud. He had a habit of thinking through problems sitting under that sky, because it made the problems feel proportional. He thought about the fact that he was 36 years old, and had been in love with his neighbor for approximately 2 years, and had done almost nothing about it for reasons that had seemed correct, and still seemed mostly correct. He thought about the things she had said on his porch that October afternoon about being angry about it being hard, and the way she had let him call her by her given name, which he understood was not a small thing. He was not a man who rushed things. He had learned from this land that rushing things produced poor results. You waited for rain, you waited for calves to drop, you waited for grass to grow back. You worked constantly in the waiting, but you did not hurry the essential things. He thought, next spring. He was not sure what he meant by that exactly, but next spring felt like the right time for something to be different. December came, and Christmas, and Bessie brought Henry over to Clyde's place on Christmas afternoon with a tin of ginger cookies she had baked that morning. And Clyde had a small carved wooden horse for Henry that he had been working on since October, small and precise and made from good cedar. And Henry's face, when he received it, was a thing that both adults filed away silently and kept. Clyde had nothing ready for Bessie, which she could see bothered him, and she said, "The cookies are for both of us." And he said, "Thank you," in a voice that had something careful and warm in it that she felt across the kitchen. They drank coffee and Henry played with the carved horse on the floor, and the afternoon settled around them with the particular ease of people who have found a rhythm. And Bessie looked at Clyde over the rim of her coffee cup and thought, "I have not been this comfortable in someone else's house since Thomas was alive," and the thought sat quietly inside her without the usual ache. January of 1886 brought a blizzard. This was not unusual for the Texas Panhandle, which had seen bad winters before, but this one was extraordinary. It came down out of the north on a Tuesday night and did not stop for 3 days. The temperature dropped to levels that killed cattle and split wood, and the snow piled against every fence and building in a way that made the landscape unrecognizable. Clyde spent the first day of the storm keeping his own cattle alive, working in the brutal cold with Emilio and George, moving cattle into the sheltered draw on the south end of his property, and packing them close enough to survive. He lost 2 head on the first night and 4 more by the morning of the second day, and this was bad but not catastrophic. What occupied his mind for the entire duration of the storm, in the relentless way of urgent things, was Bessie Wallace 200 yards to the west on the other side of the fence. She had Henry. She had her cattle, and she had the barn, and she had the farmhouse. She was, he reminded himself, entirely capable. She had survived 3 winters alone already. She had the wood stacked and the provisions laid in and the instinct for it. But this storm was different, and he knew it, and he knew she knew it. On the second day of the blizzard, during a brief lull in the wind, he did something that he made a deliberate decision about. He gathered his 2 ranch hands, Emilio and George, and told them what he intended to do, and they got out the sledge that they used for heavy winter work, and they loaded it with hay and 2 lengths of good rope, and a bag of cornmeal, and a wrapped parcel of smoked beef, and they drove it the 250 yards to the Wallace place through snow that came to the horses' bellies in the drifts. He knocked on the farmhouse door. He heard movement inside, and then the door opened and Bessie was there in the firelight, her hair loose from its braid and her face carrying the particular taut expression of someone who has been managing alone for 2 days and nights and is at the precise edge of their reserves. She looked at him. She looked at the sledge behind him with Emilio and George and the supplies. "I'm not here to help," he said, which was a lie so obvious he could see her almost smile at it. "I needed to move these supplies out of my west storage before the roof came down on them, and your barn is closer than my south structure, and I was wondering if I could store them here temporarily." There was a long pause. The wind had started up again, and it moved between them with that relentless panhandle insistence. "You stored them yourself," Bessie said, "in my barn." "If that is agreeable," he said, "and fed my cattle with the hay," she said. "It was already off the sledge," he said, "and brought me cornmeal and smoked beef." "That is separate," he said. "That is Christmas. I owed you Christmas." She looked at him for a long moment, and what passed across her face was not resistance. It was something more complicated than resistance. It was the expression of a woman who has held something very tightly for a very long time and is beginning to understand that the holding is no longer serving the purpose it once served. "Come inside," she said. "All 3 of you." Emilio and George exchanged a look over the sledge that Clyde did not see. They stayed 2 hours, Clyde and Emilio and George, and they ate cornbread that Bessie made from the new cornmeal and drank strong coffee, and Henry talked to George about horse training with the focused intensity of a 10-year-old who has found his subject. And by the time the wind dropped enough to make the return trip possible, something had shifted in the house that everyone in it could feel, but no one said directly. At the door, when Emilio and George had already gone out to the horses, Clyde paused and turned and said to Bessie, "When this lifts, I want to say something to you. Will you hear it?" Bessie looked at him and did not look away. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and went out into the snow. The blizzard broke on the 4th morning. Bessie spent that day and the next assessing the damage. She had lost 6 cattle, which was a blow, and a section of her south fence had collapsed under the snow weight, which she filed away as a spring repair job. The barn had held. The house had held. Henry was fine and already outside in the deep snow the moment she permitted it, conducting some complicated investigation of the drifts that seemed to involve a great deal of shouting. She got the cattle she had left into a routine, checked on them twice a day as the temperature crawled back up, and waited. On the 3rd day after the storm, in the early afternoon when the sun was making the snow brilliant and almost impossible to look at, she heard a horse at the gate. She was already on the porch. Clyde dismounted and tied his horse and walked up through the snow that was still knee-deep in the yard. He stopped at the porch steps and took his hat off, which he only did inside usually, and she understood that this meant something. "I said I wanted to say something," he said. "You did," she said. He looked at her with that direct, unguarded look that had been growing more visible across the last several months, as though he had been slowly taking apart a wall he had built and was now standing on the other side of it. "I have admired you since before Thomas died," he said. "That is the truth, and I am saying it plainly because I think you deserve plain speech. After Thomas died, I wanted to help you because you were a woman alone on hard land and it was right, and I tried that and you made it clear you did not need it that way. So I watched. And the more I watched, the more I understood that what I feel is not admiration, or at least it is not only admiration." He paused. The sun on the snow was very bright and his face was very clear. "I am in love with you, Bessie," he said. "I have been for a long time. I'm not asking you to feel the same or to decide anything today. I'm asking only if you will allow me to court you properly in whatever way is right to you, at whatever pace is right to you. I'm not going anywhere." The last 4 words landed in the bright, cold afternoon air with a weight that was entirely different from the others. "I am not going anywhere." On this land, in this life, in the aftermath of what she had been through, those 4 words were more significant than anything else he could have said. Bessie stood on the porch in the snow-bright afternoon and thought about the last 3 years. She thought about Thomas, and about the way grief had receded slowly, like water after a flood, leaving the land changed but still land, still hers. She thought about those long evenings with the journal. She thought about ginger cookies on Christmas and the carved cedar horse, and the way Clyde Bailey had stood between her and 2 men in Tascosa without making her feel like she needed saving. She thought about the blizzard and the sledge of supplies, and the lie about the roof that they had both known was a lie. She thought, "I am 31 years old and this land is mine and my son is well and I have built something here that is real." She thought, "I have been so afraid of needing someone that I almost missed the fact that I want this." "You brought help anyway," she said, "and then you left before I could refuse." Something surprised and tender moved across his face. "I tried to give you something you could accept," he said. "I was not always successful." "No," she said, "but you kept trying." A pause. The wind was quiet for once, which in the panhandle was itself a kind of event. "I loved Thomas Wallace," she said. "I want you to know that. It is not something I will stop. It is part of who I am." "I would not have you any other way," he said, and meant it in a way she could hear. "Then yes," she said. "You may court me, Clyde Bailey, at whatever pace is right." He put his hat back on, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from a man in her life, wide open and grateful and somehow young, and he said, "Thank you," with a simplicity that was worth more to her than any speech. Spring came. It came with the particular generosity of a panhandle spring following a brutal winter. Green so sudden, and vivid it looked almost aggressive after all that white. The wildflowers along the creek bed came in heavy, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and the grass in the low spots was already tall enough to bend in the wind by early April. Clyde and Bessie's courtship was conducted in the manner of 2 people who had been watching each other across a fence line for 3 years, and had a great deal to say once the fence was no longer between them. They talked constantly when they were together, and thought about the conversations when they were apart. He rode over on Sunday afternoons and stayed for supper now, which Henry accepted with the matter-of-fact ease of a child who has already worked out most of the important things on his own. They walked the shared fence line together on a Saturday in April, ostensibly to assess the winter damage, and spent most of the walk talking about things that had nothing to do with fences. Clyde told her about his father, who had been a hard man but a fair one, who had built the 2-room house with the intention of adding on as the family grew, and had never gotten the chance because his heart gave out at 52. Bessie told him about her own family in East Texas, her sister and her 2 brothers, the farm they had grown up on that was a different kind of land than this, wet and green, and the way she had come west with Thomas at 23 with everything she owned in a single wagon and had looked at the panhandle for the first time and felt impossibly at home. "Thomas loved this land," she said. "He always said it was honest. It did not pretend to be anything it was not." "No," Clyde agreed. "It does not. I feel that way too," she said, "even now, even after." He reached over and took her hand, which was brown and calloused and strong, and held it simply for a moment without making a performance of it, and she let him, and the fence line unreeled beside them in the spring afternoon. In May, Emilio came to Clyde one morning with the expression of a man delivering news he finds personally satisfying, and said that Henry had successfully handled a breech calf on his own the previous afternoon, Clyde being occupied on the East Range when it happened. The calf had lived. Henry had been very calm about it and then cried briefly afterward when he thought no one was watching. Clyde told Bessie this at supper that evening. Henry denied crying. Bessie looked at her son with the particular expression of a mother who knows everything and says only the things that matter and said, "I am very proud of you," and Henry looked at his plate and was clearly unable to conceal how much this meant to him. Clyde said, "You handled it the right way. Most men cry after their first breech pull, and the ones who do not are the ones you do not want near your cattle." Henry looked up at him with his father's dark eyes. "Did you cry?" he said. "For approximately 5 minutes," Clyde said. Henry thought about this and seemed to find it settling. That was the evening Bessie understood that what was happening between herself and Clyde was not only about the two of them. It was about Henry, who was 11 and needed something he had been missing for 4 years, and would never say so because he was his mother's son and had her jaw and her pride. But it was there in the way he tracked Clyde's movements when they were in the same room, in the way he repeated things Clyde said, in the way he had started calling him something other than Mr. Bailey. He called him Clyde. He had started about 3 weeks prior, and neither adult had said anything, and Henry had said it with a kind of careful casualness that revealed everything. The summer of 1886 was the warmest Clyde could remember, and the happiest he had been since his father was alive. He worked his land and watched his cattle and helped Bessie drive her herd to market in July, not as her hand but beside her, and the difference was everything. She ran her operation with a precision that he genuinely respected, the decisions clean and decisive, the records kept with a rigor that most ranchers he knew could not match. They drove the herd into Tascosa on a bright Thursday and sold at a good price, and afterward, when the business was done and the coin was in Bessie's coat, they sat in the small restaurant across from the dry goods store, all 3 of them, and ate a proper meal. And Henry had pie afterward, and Bessie allowed herself 1 cup of real coffee, not the rationed stuff at home but real coffee from fresh grounds, and she drank it with the deliberate pleasure of someone who has earned something. Clyde watched her drink it and felt something so full and uncomplicated in his chest that it almost made him laugh. "What?" Bessie said, catching his expression. "Nothing," he said. "I am just happy." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said very quietly so Henry could not hear over his pie, "So am I. August brought dust storms and heat, but nothing that could not be managed." And on an evening in late August when Henry was asleep and the house had gone quiet and the stars were very bright through the kitchen window, Clyde took Bessie's hand across the kitchen table and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not today." "I am not asking today. I want to know if the idea is possible for you." Bessie was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the last of the summer crickets were doing their work, and somewhere out in the pasture, one of the cattle moved in the darkness. "Why are you asking if it is possible instead of just asking?" she said. "Because I want to do this right," he said. "Because you have spent 3 years being your own person and building your own thing, and I do not want to come in here and assume my way of asking is the right way. I am asking if you are ready for the question before I ask it." She looked at him, and the directness she felt from him at that moment was so total and uncomplicated that it moved through her like light through good glass. "Ask," she said. He looked at her. He turned her hand over in both of his. "Bessie Wallace," he said, "will you marry me? I love you. I love Henry. I love this land, and I want to build whatever comes next on it next to you with you. My property and yours, my life and yours, for however long God gives us." The crickets continued their work outside. The stars continued their patient burning. Bessie Wallace, who had spent 3 years refusing help from the neighbor whose land touched hers, who had dug water trenches alone and driven cattle to market alone, and held her own against drought and blizzard and the bone-deep loneliness of a hard frontier life, looked at Clyde Bailey across the kitchen table and felt the last of the careful defensive distance inside her dissolve, like frost in a morning sun, not dramatically, not all at once, but completely. "Yes," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his forehead against it for a moment with his eyes closed, and she put her other hand on top of his, and they stayed like that in the kitchen quiet for a long time. They were married in September of 1886 at the small church in Tascosa, a Presbyterian congregation that met in a whitewashed building with a metal roof that drummed magnificently in the rain. The ceremony was simple and short, the way both of them wanted it. Emilio and George were there, and Jim Rook, who had come back for the summer and agreed to stay through winter now. Bessie's sister Margaret had made the trip from Amarillo and stood with bright eyes and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this for years. Henry stood beside his mother during the ceremony in a new shirt and with his dark hair combed flat, and stood straight with the proud, solemn bearing of a child who understands the occasion completely. When the minister reached the part about the joining of two lives, Henry looked at Clyde with the directness of his mother and the steady, dark eyes of his father, and Clyde looked back at him with an expression so openly warm that Margaret, who did not know Clyde Bailey at all, pressed her hand to her mouth. After the ceremony, standing outside in the September sun with the smell of cottonwood and dry grass in the air, Henry reached over and took Clyde's hand. Just took it. Simply, like it was already true. Clyde held on. The practical business of joining two ranches was complicated and interesting, and exactly the kind of project that both Bessie and Clyde were equipped for. They debated for a month about whether to combine the operations entirely or maintain separate tallies, and in the end combined the cattle into a single herd under a new brand they designed together, a simple B over C in iron, Bessie insisting on her initial first. Clyde had laughed and agreed without argument. Clyde moved his essential belongings into the Wallace house, which was the larger structure, and they spent an October weekend reconfiguring the space, moving furniture, arguing productively about where the extra wardrobe should go, and discovering in the process that they had the same instinct about living spaces, which was to keep them simple and functional with one or two things in each room that were purely beautiful. His two-room house on the east end of the property became the bunkhouse for Emilio and George, who had been living in a cramped structure behind the main barn and were clearly relieved about the upgrade, though neither expressed this directly. Henry officially gained a father figure in the practical daily sense, and the texture of the household changed in ways both subtle and significant. Clyde got up early, as Bessie did, and they developed a morning rhythm together that felt within weeks as though it had always existed. The division of the days first worked natural and efficient. The coffee shared in the kitchen before the sun was fully up. The conversation about the day's plan as unhurried and necessary as breathing. Henry bloomed in a way that made Bessie's chest ache with gratitude. He was 11 and a half and already showing the particular competence of a ranch-raised child, but there was something new in it now, a confidence that came from having a second adult who took him seriously as a learning person. Clyde treated Henry's questions as worth answering fully and Henry's observations as worth considering, and this was not a performance. It was simply how Clyde thought people ought to be treated. One afternoon in November, Bessie found Clyde and Henry in the barn, in the middle of an intense consultation about the spotted pony Pepper, who had been brought over from Clyde's place and was now officially Henry's horse. The consultation concerned some complex point about the horse's way of moving when it was nervous, and both of them were so absorbed in it that they did not notice her standing in the barn doorway for a full minute, and she let herself just stand there and look at them, the tall man and the dark-eyed boy, heads bent over the horse in the slant of afternoon light, and the feeling that moved through her had no words adequate to it. She stored it away in the place where she kept the things that mattered. Winter of 1886 was mild, which was its own kind of gift. The merged cattle herd came through with only minor losses, and they entered spring with strong numbers and good range grass coming on early. Clyde expanded the water trench system that Bessie had started 4 years earlier, building on her original design with modifications he had thought about for 2 years. And between the two of them, the system was eventually good enough that they could manage a full dry summer without the level of crisis the previous dry years had brought. Bessie discovered she was expecting a child in the early spring of 1887. She told Clyde on a Sunday morning with a directness that was entirely her own, standing in the kitchen with the coffee pot in her hand, and said, "I need you to know that I am going to continue working the ranch through this. I did it with Henry and I intend to do it again." Clyde looked at her with an expression so warm it could have grown grass. "I know you will," he said. "I would not suggest otherwise." "Good," she said, and poured the coffee, and that was how that was settled. The pregnancy was straightforward. Bessie worked through it with the same efficient ferocity she brought to everything, making adjustments where necessary without complaint, and without calling attention to the adjustments she was not making. Henry, now 12, treated the whole situation with the serious interest of someone who has lived on a working ranch and understands reproduction as a practical reality. Though he was also clearly and touchingly excited about the prospect of a sibling, in a way that he managed by talking about it only occasionally and with great dignity. The child was born in October of 1887, a boy they named Robert Thomas Bailey, Robert for Clyde's father and Thomas for the man whose name lived in the land and in Henry's eyes, and in the particular stubbornness of Bessie's jaw. Clyde had suggested Thomas without hesitation, and Bessie had looked at him with those clear brown eyes, and something had passed between them that did not require language. Robert was born early in the morning in the farmhouse bedroom with the help of the capable Mrs. Hendricks from Tascosa, who had attended most of the births in the county for 15 years. He arrived with a full head of dark hair and an expression of deep displeasure at the entire situation, and within the hour was eating with the focused determination that would characterize him for the rest of his life. Henry held his brother with the careful solemnity of a 12-year-old given a significant responsibility, and looked up at his parents with his father's dark eyes and said, "He is a lot smaller than a calf." Clyde made a sound that might have been a laugh, and Bessie said, "He will grow." And the room was warm and the morning light was coming up gold through the window, and outside the land was doing what it always did, enormous and honest and entirely itself. Life on the joined Bailey Wallace Ranch in 1887 and 1888 settled into a rhythm that was demanding and full and very good. The operation was now large enough to require consistent help, and Emilio and George were joined by a third hand, a quiet man named Samuel who came from one of the trail drives that passed through the county and decided to stay when Clyde offered him fair wages and a clean bunk. Samuel turned out to have an almost supernatural ability with sick cattle, which made him irreplaceable within one season. Bessie continued to keep the books with her particular rigor, a fact that impressed every man who had occasion to look at them, which in 1888 included the Tascosa Bank's new representative, who came out to review their note situation and left with the expression of someone who has discovered that things are considerably better organized than expected. Clyde managed the range work with the patient competence of a man who has spent his whole life reading land. They talked every evening about the ranch, about what needed doing, about what had been done, and these conversations were both business and intimacy, the kind of deep daily collaboration that builds something more durable than romantic gestures. They were also very much in love. This was visible in small, specific ways, in the way he brought her coffee without being asked when she was doing the books late at night, in the way she saved the stories she heard in Tascosa to tell him in the evenings, timing the best ones for when he looked most tired, in the way they walked the property together on quiet Sunday afternoons, not always talking, comfortable in the silence that people build between them when they trust each other, in the way he still looked at her, after a year of marriage, with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and does not intend to take it for granted, in the way she sometimes caught him looking and felt, Still, that brief and pleasant disruption in her chest that she had felt the first time she admitted to herself that she wanted this. Henry turned 13 in the autumn of 1888 and was tall enough now to look Emilio in the eye and strong enough to do a full day's ranch work without significant help. He was also, quietly and without making a particular thing of it, Clyde's son in every way that mattered. They rode together, worked together, argued occasionally about cattle management with the comfortable intensity of two people who respect each other's opinion and will not simply defer. And Clyde had started teaching Henry to keep a separate set of the ranch tallies as training, checking his work with the patient thoroughness of a man who takes education seriously. Henry asked Clyde one morning, in the direct way he had of asking the things he was actually thinking about, whether it would be all right if he sometimes called him Pa. Not always. Not to replace anything. Just sometimes. Clyde was quiet for long enough that Henry started to think he had made a mistake, and then Clyde said, in a voice that was very careful and even, "I would be honored by that." Henry nodded once, satisfied, and went back to the saddle he was working on, and Clyde went out to the pasture and stood in the grass for a while looking at nothing. He wrote a letter that evening, the only letter anyone had seen him write in years, to no one anyone knew. Emilio, who brought it to the post office in Tascosa, did not ask and Clyde did not explain. Years later, Bessie found out it had been to Thomas Wallace's parents in East Texas. She did not know exactly what it said. She chose not to ask because she understood already, in the way she had come to understand most things about this man, that it said what needed to be said and nothing else. The year 1889 brought a period of significant change to the Texas Panhandle, as the cattle industry continued its complex evolution, and the XIT Ranch's massive expansion shifted land and water rights in ways that required small operators to be sharp and strategic. Clyde and Bessie spent considerable time in Tascosa that year, navigating legal documents and boundary questions with the steady, careful attention of people who have learned that what you do not watch over, you lose. They retained their property without concession. This was not automatic or easy. It required Bessie to sit across a desk from a land agent who addressed all of his comments to Clyde and twice called Bessie, the little woman, and once the missus. And it required her to correct him each time with a smile so composed and precise it left him slightly unsettled. And it required Clyde to say, in a perfectly even voice, that his wife handled the contracts and her name was on the deed, and perhaps it might be useful to speak to her directly. The land agent had adjusted his approach. They kept their land. Bessie drove home from that meeting with Robert asleep in the wagon beside her, heavy and warm against her side at almost 2 years old, and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost quiet. She looked at the land as they came back onto their property, the grass and the sky and the fence line running straight into the distance, and she felt, as she had since the first time she saw it, entirely at home. Robert grew. He was a Bailey through and through from the beginning, broad-shouldered for his age, deliberate in his movements, with his father's way of going still and watching before he committed to anything. He also had Bessie's stubbornness so concentrated and pure it was almost scientific, and the combination of the two traits in a child who was barely walking produced scenarios that his parents found simultaneously exhausting and irresistible. Henry, at 14, treated his little brother with an affectionate authority that was so perfectly pitched between guidance and tolerance that Bessie sometimes watched them together and felt almost tearful, though she would never have described it that way. In the spring of 1890, Bessie and Clyde discovered that a second child was on the way, which made Robert, who was 2.5 and did not fully understand the concept, very suspicious about the changes happening in the household. The pregnancy was as uncomplicated as the first, and in November of 1890 they had a daughter they named Clara Me Bailey, me for Bessie's mother. Clara arrived in the world with Bessie's brown eyes and an immediate, categorical opinion about everything, and it became evident within the first week that she intended to operate on her own schedule and no one else's, which the entire household recognized as a Wallace characteristic and received with resigned affection. By the time Clara was born, the Bailey Ranch was one of the better-run medium operations in the county. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but stable and increasing, with a water management system that other ranchers had started asking about, and with a reputation for fair dealing and honest accounting that meant their cattle always sold well because buyers knew what they were getting. Emilio, who was approaching 60 by now, had begun to slow slightly, and Clyde had started a quiet, careful renegotiation of the man's work responsibilities, shifting him toward the training and oversight work that his experience was perfectly suited for and away from the heavy physical work that the younger hands could handle. Emilio accepted this with the dignity of a man who knows the difference between being respected and being sidelined. Henry at 15 had become, without particular ceremony, the most capable young ranch hand in the county. He was also beginning to have the particular energy and restlessness of a boy who is about to be a man and does not quite know what to do with the transition. Clyde managed this with a patience that Bessie observed with considerable appreciation, giving Henry more responsibility and more genuine consequence for his decisions, without removing the safety net that a 15-year-old still needs. One evening Clyde came in from the barn and said to Bessie, "I think Henry ought to take the spring drive himself next year. He can take Emilio and Samuel and run it without me riding alongside." Bessie was quiet for a moment, not worried exactly, just measuring. "You think he is ready?" she said. "I think he will be by spring," Clyde said, "and I think he knows it, and not knowing whether we know it is starting to be a problem." Bessie thought about this and then said, "Tell him tomorrow." Henry, told the following morning over breakfast, received this information with a carefully controlled reaction that consisted of going extremely still for about 4 seconds, and then saying, "All right," in a voice that was 3 notes lower than usual, and then standing up from the table and going outside, and then coming back in 10 minutes later having clearly stood outside and felt a great number of things he was not going to describe. "Thank you," he said to Clyde and his mother both, with the seriousness of a treaty being signed. By 1891, the Bailey Wallace Ranch, which everyone in the county had started calling the Bailey place simply because it was easier, though Bessie still called it by both names in the books, was entering a period of what might reasonably be called prosperity. Not extravagance, not by any panhandle definition of the word, but stable and growing, with enough margin that the bad years did not threaten the whole, and enough good years accumulated now that the bad ones could be absorbed. Bessie kept a journal still, not as she had in the grieving years, but in a different way, a record of what was built and what was growing, practical and personal both. On an evening in the fall of 1891, she sat at the same desk Thomas had made and opened a new volume, and on the first page she wrote the date and the state of the herd and the weather and the price of cattle in Tascosa, and then below that she wrote, "Robert ate 4 biscuits at supper and tried to convince Clara that one of them was hers. Clara was not convinced. Henry brought the horses in from the south pasture without being asked. Clyde fixed the water pump and came in with grease on his hands, and I made him wash them twice. It was a good day. Most of them are." She closed the journal and sat for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway she could hear the low sound of Clyde's voice reading to the children before bed, some story out of the almanac because that was what Clara had requested, and Clara's periodic sharp commentary on the information being presented, and Robert's heavier breathing that meant he was almost asleep. She thought about the woman she had been in the summer of 1882, standing at Thomas's grave on a bruise-colored afternoon making herself promises. She thought about the 3 years she had kept those promises with both hands and both feet and everything she had in her. She thought about a man on the other side of a fence line who had brought help anyway and left before she could refuse, who had given her an excuse instead of a rescue, who had waited for her in the particular patient way that was its own form of love. She thought about how she had been so afraid of needing someone that she had almost confused needing with wanting, and how it had taken 3 years and 1 blizzard and 4 words, "I am not going anywhere," to make her understand the difference. She stood up from the desk and walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there in the warm light, watching. Clara was sitting up very straight in Clyde's lap with the expression of a judge evaluating testimony. Robert had gone fully asleep against his father's arm, heavy and complete. Clyde was reading about river formations in the Colorado Territory with the willing attention of a man who has long since accepted that the almanac is what Clara wants, and the almanac is what Clara gets. He looked up and saw Bessie in the doorway, and the expression that moved across his face was the one she knew best, the one he had no mask for, open and warm and containing, as it had from the beginning that quality of keeping careful track. She walked in and sat beside him, and he shifted to make room without interrupting his reading, and Clara accepted her mother's presence with a brief acknowledging lean before returning her full attention to the question of river formations. And Robert slept on in the deep and absolute way of a well-fed child. And outside the panhandle night was enormous and full of stars, and the land was honest in its darkness, and entirely, unequivocally, theirs. The spring of 1892 brought Henry's first solo cattle drive, which he ran with Emilio and Samuel over 5 days to Amarillo and back, and from which he returned with the money, the correct count, and the bearing of a young man who has done something real and knows it. He gave Bessie the payment envelope with both hands, which was how Thomas used to give her things, though Henry did not know that, and she held the envelope for a moment with her eyes very still before she opened it. "Well done," she said, and meant it completely. Henry, who was 16 and had spent the last 4 years becoming himself with the steady help of 2 people who loved him, nodded once. Then he went to find Clyde because he had a great deal to say about the Amarillo market prices, and he knew Clyde would want to hear all of it and ask the right questions. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The Panhandle had drought cycles and market cycles, and one particularly brutal winter in 1893 that tested every operation in the county. But the Bailey Ranch had built enough resilience by then that the difficult years did not break what had been built, only bent it temporarily and then let it straighten again. Clara grew into a force of nature. By 7, she had an opinion on cattle management that she shared freely, and that was, irritatingly, sometimes correct. Robert at 5 was already learning to read brands from Henry, who was an excellent teacher because he could still remember not knowing things and explained accordingly. Clyde put in 2 new rooms on the farmhouse in the summer of 1893, taking the addition Thomas had never gotten to make, and the house expanded around the family it held with the organic logic of something that has grown rather than something that has been constructed. Bessie's sister Margaret visited from Amarillo in the summer of 1893 and spent 2 weeks on the ranch, and drove everyone slightly mad with her certainty about everything and her profound love for them all, which were not unrelated characteristics. She and Bessie sat on the porch in the evenings and talked the way sisters do when they have not seen each other enough and are making up for it, and Margaret, who had known Bessie through all of it, from the marriage to Thomas to the grief to the 3 years alone to the slow and deliberate opening toward Clyde, said at one point quietly, "You are very happy." "I am," Bessie said. "I was worried those first 3 years," Margaret said. "I was afraid you were going to wall yourself in so completely you would never come back out." Bessie thought about this. "I almost did," she said. "I had very good reasons." "What changed them?" Bessie looked out at the land, at the last of the evening light on the grass, at the smoke from the kitchen, at Henry crossing the yard with a bucket in each hand, at Clyde coming out of the barn with his sleeves rolled up and looking her way automatically, the way he always did, as though checking that she was still there, and finding this information satisfying. "He kept showing up," she said. "He kept bringing the help anyway and leaving before I could refuse it. He gave me things I could accept without losing what I needed to keep." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He is a good man," she said. "He is," Bessie said. "He is also the most patient human being I have ever encountered," which was probably the quality that saved us both. They sat on the porch until the dark came fully down, and the stars came out in that panhandle way, in their thousands, burning clean and steady above the flat, enormous land. And inside the house, Robert and Clara were conducting some complicated negotiation that involved a great deal of volume and Clyde's voice intervening with calm authority, and then the sound of laughter. And Bessie sat in her chair on her porch on her land, and felt the particular and irreplaceable satisfaction of a woman who has built something real and knows exactly what it is worth. In 1895, Henry Wallace Bailey, as he had taken to signing his name on the ranch documents, married a woman named Priscilla Danes from a small farm north of Tascosa, a quiet and capable woman with a dry sense of humor, and a genuine gift for horses that immediately made her Emilio's favorite person on the property. The wedding was in April, small and warm, at the same church in Tascosa where Bessie and Clyde had married 9 years before. Bessie watched Henry and Priscilla under the afternoon light outside the church and felt joy and grief braided together the way they always are at these moments. Grief for Thomas, who should have been there. Joy so complete it almost hurt. And beside her Clyde took her hand and she pressed it, and they understood each other without language the way they had learned to do. Emilio, who had attended both weddings and showed no signs of stopping, drank his coffee at the reception with the expression of a man who has watched something unfold over many years from the best possible vantage point, and finds the result entirely satisfactory. George had left the previous year, gone to work for a larger operation near Lubbock, and the goodbye had been genuine and uncomplicated, the way goodbyes are between people who respect each other and do not make more of things than they are. Samuel stayed. He had nowhere else he wanted to be, he said, which was the longest statement most people had ever heard him make. The century was drawing toward its end and the panhandle was changing around them, slowly and then less slowly. The great cattle trail era was giving way to the railroad era, which changed the shape of everything, the drives, the markets, the towns. Tascosa itself was beginning its long, slow decline as the railroad went to other routes. Clyde and Bessie drove into Tascosa less often and to Amarillo more, tracking the shifts with the attentive pragmatism of people who have learned that the land endures and the human arrangements around it change, and you adapt or you do not. Their operation adapted. They kept cattle but began, in the early 1890s, to diversify into wheat, which was increasingly what the panhandle dirt could produce that the market wanted, and the combination of the two gave them a stability through the later 90s that many pure cattle operations could not sustain. Henry managed the South Range with increasing independence and skill, and he and Priscilla were expecting their first child by 1896, which made Bessie a grandmother at 42, a status she received with the same direct, unfussy composure with which she received most things, and which deceived no one who saw her face when she held the baby, a boy named Thomas Edward Bailey, the first of what would eventually be 4 grandchildren. Clara at 6 was an event. Clara at 8 was a phenomenon. Clara at 10, in 1900, was enrolled in the school in Amarillo that Margaret had been advocating for since before Clara could walk, because Clara had a mind like a steel trap and an appetite for information that the ranch, as much as she loved it, could not fully satisfy. Clyde drove her to Amarillo in the fall of 1900 and came back without her and went out to the barn and stayed there for an hour in the way a man stays somewhere when he is managing a feeling he will not display in the house. Bessie let him. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about Clara's face at the school gate, excited and homesick and determined all at once, and she understood that the best things you build are the things that leave you because they are strong enough to. Robert, at 13, was already the most certain person on the ranch about what he wanted, which was everything his father did exactly. He was broad and steady, and watched the land with Clyde's particular quality of patient attention and rode horses with his mother's natural authority. He was going to be a rancher if he chose it, and a good one, and he had already chosen it without question, which both his parents accepted with love, and the small private wish, which they never voiced, that he would also want some things beyond the fence line. He did, eventually, but that is later. On a morning in the fall of 1900, on the morning after Clara had gone to Amarillo and the house had a new quiet in it, Bessie and Clyde sat on the porch together with their coffee in the early light, the way they did most mornings, the land opening up around them in its vast, honest way, the grass going gold in the autumn cold, the sky beginning its movement from dark to the particular clean blue of a panhandle morning. They had been married 14 years. They had buried 2 cattle dogs and 1 good horse, and Emilio's predecessor on the north fence, and a section of the barn roof twice more in Thomas's memory, and the version of themselves they had been before. They had built 2 children and helped build 1 more, and they had kept the land and the water and the fair dealing, and the careful accounts through drought and blizzard and market swings and legal threats and the turning of the century. Clyde said, "I have been thinking about the north pasture." "I know," Bessie said. "The drainage is still wrong. If we extended the original trench system another 40 yards north, I calculated it last winter," she said. "We would need about 3 days of work and maybe $12 in materials." He turned and looked at her. "You already planned it." "I planned it in February," she said. "I was waiting for you to notice the problem." Something moved across his face, that particular expression she had seen for the first time on a fence line in 1885, and that was still in the fall of 1900 exactly the same, wide open and warm and keeping careful track. "You could have told me in February," he said. "You would have figured it out," she said. "You always do." "Bessie," he said in the voice he used when something had moved him past his usual composure. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "Considerably." She looked at him in the early light, this man who had stood at her fence for 3 years and waited, who had brought help anyway and left before she could refuse it, who had given her his father's north pasture drainage analysis and his patient attention and his whole unguarded heart, who had held her son's hand at a wedding and built 2 children with her, and adapted to her stubbornness with a grace that still, some days, made her want to put her face in her hands and be grateful until it hurt. "I love you too, Clyde Bailey," she said, "considerably and then some." He reached over and took her coffee cup from her hands, set it on the rail, and kissed her in the morning light on the porch of the house that was hers and his, in the middle of the land that was hers and his, in the middle of the life that had been built from refusal and patience, and showing up anyway. The panhandle stretched out around them, enormous and honest, not pretending to be anything it was not, and the grass moved in the wind the way it always had, and the sky was enormous and clear, and the smoke from the kitchen went up straight in the still morning air, and it was very good. Henry came around the side of the barn 20 minutes later with Robert behind him, and stopped at the sight of his mother and stepfather still on the porch together, not doing anything particular, just sitting close with their coffee, and talking in the low, easy voices of people who have a great deal to say to each other and all the time in the world to say it. He stood there for a moment, and Robert, who was 13 and had not yet learned to let things be what they were without comment, said, "What are they doing?" Henry looked at the 2 figures on the porch, his mother with her straight back and her capable hands and the brown eyes she had given him, and the man who had taught him to read weather and break horses and keep fair accounts and call something by its right name. "They are just being where they are," Henry said. Robert considered this and decided it was an acceptable answer. They went in through the back door for breakfast, and the smoke went on rising straight up into the clean blue panhandle sky, and the land went on being exactly what it was, and everything was entirely, permanently, well.